And then in the 1930s, that all began to change. In the UK, we had what was known as a courgette. It's the same thing. It's no different whatsoever. It's just I didn't eat it, either in the 1930s or back when I lived in the UK. I've just realised only one of those things applies to me. Hello, I'm Lawrence, and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to food, but not the consuming of food, the speaking of it. Plenty of YouTubers might compare UK versus US words from the relative safety of their home country, but I'm here to give you a different perspective. How living in America for more than a decade has caused me to go from using one set of words to the other. In this case, because food consumption is an everyday activity, it is absolutely inevitable, which is the opposite of evitable. Who made up English, that food names more than just about any other words enter your vocabulary after years of living in another country. Recently, of course, I talked about mealtime words that I've picked up while living in America, such as, supper, cookout, entree. But today we're going to move on to the food itself, or at least the words we use to describe them. That's right, as the winter chill sets in and the need for hot food rises faster than a Yorkshire pudding, I'm going to come clean about the 6 food words I've picked up since moving to the United States. I don't know why I went all Australian. Starting with this one. Ah, yes, the good old chips versus fries debate. For the longest time, of course, I used the term chips. Will still use the term chips if I'm specifically referring to fish and chips, which I occasionally order from the local pub. But other than that, since moving to the United States, I have defaulted to saying fries. Notice, though, that I don't say French fries. That's one word too many in my book. And I think, most Americans probably don't anymore either since the 1970s. In fact, records indicate that most Americans have shortened it to fries, as I do. And it's easy, and people know what I mean when I say it. Firstly, if I go into any fast food restaurant here and ask for large chips, firstly, I'll be questioning why I'm getting a large size. And secondly, they'll have no idea what I mean. They might hand me a packet, of course, of crisps. Now, I should point out, actually, that I think fries is the common usage in fast food restaurants in Britain, so that was perhaps not the best example. But for the most part, you could go into, let's say, Red Lobster, right? And you get steak fries with your seafood, which is weird. You're still referring to them as steak fries and not chips. And there's kind of an interesting history around the use of the term French fries in the United States. If you could get a time machine and go all the way back to 1802, you might just gatecrash a party that was being hosted at the White House by Thomas Jefferson. That could alter history dramatically. Don't do that. But at that very dinner, he had potatoes served in the French manner, and this is sort of seen as one of the early indications of French-inspired potatoes coming to the United States. Moreover, about 50 years later, in 1856, the first instance of something linguistically resembling French fries appeared in a book. This book, in fact, Cookery for Maids of All Work by Eliza Warren, in which she uses the term French fried potatoes. And it wouldn't be for another 50 years after that, in 1902, until we saw the first references to French fries itself. And as I alluded to earlier on, Americans chipped off one of the words and usually just goes with fries now since about the 70s, which sort of coincides, of course, with the fast food industry, which started earlier on in the 20th century. Meanwhile, the aforementioned fish and chips that we love so much in England was coming about at around the same time that cookbook actually emerged, about the 1850s, 1860s. And while we're on the subject of C words, that brings us on to our next entry. It's not that C word. This one's a little bit balmy, isn't it? I think when I think of a cookie, at least in my British brain, I think very specifically of a chocolate chipped cookie. Everything else that Americans call a cookie in Britain is known as a biscuit. But over time, that's sort of changed for me. I won't say that the word biscuit in that context has completely been eradicated from my word usage, but it's neck and neck now. It really just depends on the mood and how much I want one. Even now that I'm talking about one, I want one. Or 5, but thankfully I'm off chocolate this year, so I've got an excuse not to, because it rots the teeth. And I'm already British, I don't want more of that. But the word cookie in the United States has a rather surprising history. So anybody that knows anything about Christmas in the United States will know that people leave out cookies and milk for Santa Claus. Santa Claus and cookie have one thing in common. They both came from Dutch. So Santa Claus came from Sinterklaas and cookie from Kirkja. I'm almost certain I've butchered the pronunciation there. Dutch people, tell me in the comments below. But on the other hand, biscuit does have currency here in the United States, but it means something quite a bit different. The nearest comparison, or the comparison that people usually draw up between an American biscuit and something that we might have back home, is that it's very similar to what could be defined as a savoury scone, or scone. Let's not get that debate started again. But the funny thing is, both countries' definitions of the word biscuit actually kind of come together when you look at the origin of that very word. It comes from the Latin phrase panis biscottus, and that literally meant bread twice baked. So that actually sounds closer to what we have here in the United States. But keep in mind that very bread was hard and baked in thin cakes, giving rise, pun intended, to the British usage. Now, perhaps not so coincidentally, the American usage of biscuit came into usage in about the early 19th century, intriguingly around the very same time that cookie did the same. And now, on to another C word. This whole list is C words. Just get used to it. Who doesn't love a bowl of hot, spicy chili on a cold winter's day like this, except children under 1? And Americans, you might be thinking, well, of course Britain doesn't have chili. It doesn't do Mexican stuff. Well, firstly, that's not true. That's all changed in the United Kingdom recently. But even back in the day, we bucked the trend on that rule of thumb. Chili was not only something we did, we actually used the full Mexican name for it, which is chili con carne. That specifically means chili with meat. Now, of course, in the United States or elsewhere, perhaps, chili doesn't have to have meat. It's just that in the UK, meat or otherwise, we do refer to it more or less across the board as chili con carne, although I will concede we mostly do put meat in it. All that to say, the term chili con carne originated in northern Mexico / southern Texas, and to the extent that Americans, even back in the day, were using the term quite widespreadly, if that is a real adverb, as used in this 1907 issue of What to Eat magazine. Over time, during the 20th century, as with, French fries, Americans started to abbreviate it to just chili, and for Britain, that particular memo was lost in the pond. And just there, as we go from C to shining C, we now go once again from the letter C to the letter C. Bring on our next entry. Not only is it another C word, it's another Spanish-derived word, cilantro. Now, I must admit, and this is going to apply to the last 3 entries on this list, I never really had cause to use the British equivalent of this word when I lived in Britain, because mostly I lived a very unhealthy life. But the British equivalent to cilantro is coriander, and in fact, coriander had a lot of currency in American English prior to cilantro's entry. Indeed, here it is showing up in a Harvard University publication from 1805 in the not-so-succinctly titled A Botanical Dictionary or Elements of Systematic and Philosophical Botany. I bet that sold like hotcakes. Whereas cilantro is a relatively new addition to American English. It didn't actually really take off until the latter half of the 20th century, presumably due to Mexican influence. And so cilantro was really my first introduction to this concept, and it's the word I've only ever used really to describe this very herb. Of course, I'd heard of the word coriander, I just never used it because I didn't trust green things on my sandwiches. Or purple things. Purple things such as eggplant. Now, in the UK, we refer to eggplant as aubergine. That comes from French, but funnily enough, the word aubergine literally means fruit of the eggplant. So we're on the same wavelength in many ways. It's just that the Americans have anglicized it or Americanized it. Either way, whichever country you are in, the fruit does look a little like a thingy. Now, when I lived in the UK, I had no cause to eat this thing because it looked revolting, and I very, very rarely used the term aubergine. It's only when I became a vegetarian in the United States later on in life that I started eating this thing en masse. That's an exaggeration. I ate it once a month. And the term eggplant just, entered my vocabulary and has stayed there ever since, and I don't refer it to anything but that. Now again, I think in reverse, if I were to go back to England, in order to make sense to the people to whom I'm speaking, I would probably use aubergine, but right now eggplant feels right, and it's felt right for Americans for hundreds of years, as evidenced by another book from 1805 by Harvard University. They were very busy with long titles that year. A Plain and Easy Introduction to the Knowledge and Practice of Gardening with Hints on Fish Ponds. So that was not lost in the pond. And if you're sitting at home red-faced because I made that reference to eggplants looking like a thingy, wait until our final entry. Or don't, because here it is. Oh, zucchini, rude little thing that people nonetheless like to chop with a knife, was another 20th century divergence. This particular squash was not common to either country before the 20th century. And then in the 1930s, that all began to change. In the UK, we had what was known as a courgette. It's the same thing. It's no different whatsoever. It's just I didn't eat it. either in the 1930s or back when I lived in the UK. I've just realised only one of those things applies to me. And just prior to that, the squash made its way over to the United States, presumably via Italian immigrants who came over, brought it with them, and were using the Italian word zucchini, which fell into use in the United States. It's been used here ever since, and like I said, the healthier I've gotten in the United States, the more I've come to be the person that chops up the willy, the zucchini. And I now use that term. And those were 6 food words I've definitely picked up while living in the United States. And let me know in the comments below if you were surprised by the inordinate number of C words that were in this list. And if you haven't had the chance to do so yet, subscribe to this channel so that my videos don't get lost in the pond. I want to do a big shout out to all of my patrons, by the way, who make this channel what it is. Without my patrons, who are growing by the week, in number, not in height, that would be weird, I wouldn't have the technology that I have. I wouldn't have the writing and the research and the rude puns. So I would have them. They've been with me my whole life. But still, if you would like to become a patron of Lost in the Pond, you can do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond. Anybody that does so gets access to my weekly secret live stream, and anyone who pledges $5 or more a month will get access to not just that, but my secret podcast and more. Until next time, whatever you call these foods, eat healthfully, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you for watching this episode of Lost in the Pond. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and if you would like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.